Imagine you are renovating your dream getaway, a remote, hand-built cabin nestled deep in the jagged peaks of the Adirondacks, when you knock down a false wall in the basement and find a room that isn't on any floor plan. You step inside, expecting dust and old lumber, but instead, your flashlight beam hits thousands of pounds of human hair, meticulously braided and hanging from the rafters like weeping willow branches. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the hair isn't just old, it's organized by color, length, and texture. And as you turn to leave, you hear a wet, rhythmic clicking sound coming from the vent above you, followed by a voice that sounds exactly like your own, whispering, "I've been waiting for a new color." If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite antique renovation hammer and bury it 6 feet deep in the backyard right before they start their next weekend DIY project. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the deep, lightless woods of upstate New York. An area where the timber is so thick it feels like the forest is constantly leaning in to hear you breathe. Our main character is a man named Toby. Toby was a freelance architect who wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city, so he bought a fixer-upper cabin that had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. He knew the history of the area was a bit off, whispers of people vanishing in the whistling woods and strange. Tall figures seen standing at the edge of campsites, but Toby was a man of logic and blueprints. He didn't believe in the Wendigo or any other spirit of the woods. He believed in cedar planks and solid foundations. But in the autumn of 2023, Toby realized that some foundations are built on things much darker than stone. Toby spent his first month alone, working from dawn until dusk. But as October arrived, the atmosphere in the valley shifted. The wind died down to an oppressive silence, the kind of quiet where every bird and cricket simply ceases to exist, leaving you alone with the sound of your own panicked heartbeat. One night, Toby was measuring the basement when he noticed a discrepancy in the wall dimensions. He took a sledgehammer to a section of wood, and the wall gave way, revealing a narrow, hidden corridor. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the stagnant air. The smell hit him first, the scent of wet copper and old earth. At the end of the corridor was a heavy oak door, bolted from the outside. He slid the bolt and pushed it open. The room was filled, floor to ceiling, with human hair. There were long, blonde tresses, matted black curls, and braids of every shade imaginable. It looked like a macabre gallery. Toby felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him as he saw a small, familiar ribbon tied to one of the braids. It was identical to the one his younger sister wore the day she vanished 10 years ago. He dropped his light. The silence was broken by a jerky, unnatural gait coming from the floorboards above him, a snapping and clicking sound like breaking bone with every step. Toby sat perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, a voice came through the floorboards. It was his sister's voice, perfectly clear and high-pitched. "Toby, did you find my room? I've been so hungry." Toby scrambled out of the basement, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't pack his gear. He didn't grab his keys. He ran for the tree line, feeling the creature right behind him. He saw a pale, spindly shape moving through the branches above him, easily 9 feet tall, its skeletal ribs pushing through translucent skin, with eyes that were nothing but hollow pits of endless, starving hunger. Every time he stumbled, he heard a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. He finally reached his truck and pinned the throttle, driving until he hit the nearest town. When search and rescue later went back to the cabin, they found the basement door wide open. The hair was gone. The room was completely empty, except for a single handheld camera, Toby's camera, which he swore he had left in the kitchen. When they played the footage, there was no video of Toby. There was only 30 minutes of a wet clicking sound, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator whispering, "The collection is almost complete." There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the thing that marks its prey with trophies, doesn't just want your life. It harvests your identity piece by piece until you are nothing but a shell. It wears your memories like a mask. Tapi pertanyaan yang sebenarnya adalah ini. Toby pindah ke kota dan tidak pernah kembali ke hutan. Tapi semalamnya terbangun karena suara gatal di pintu kamarnya. Ia melihat ke bawah selah pintu, dan ia melihat tumpukan rambut manusia yang panjang dan pirang sedang ditarik masuk ke dalam lubang ventilasi udaranya, diikuti oleh suara bisikan ibunya yang sudah lama meninggal, menanyakan apakah Toby ingin melihat koleksi barunya. What just happened? Imagine you were sitting in a remote hunting cabin, miles away from the nearest cell tower, waiting for your best friend to return from his solo trek into the frozen brush. You hear his familiar heavy boots on the porch, you hear him whistle that same off-key tune he always does, and when he walks through the door, he looks exactly like the man you've known for 20 years. But then, he sits down across from you, stares into the fire with unblinking eyes, and asks you a question about a memory that never happened using a voice that sounds like it's being played through a broken speaker. You look down at his shadow on the wall, and instead of a man, you see something with antlers and limbs that are 5 feet too long, and you realize with a jolt of pure electricity that whatever just walked into your cabin is wearing your friend's skin like a cheap, ill-fitting suit. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite camouflage hunting jacket and sew the sleeves shut right before they head out for a weekend trek into the deepest, coldest part of the Alaskan wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the frozen, unforgiving landscape of the Yukon Territory, a place where the trees are so thick they seem to hold their breath. And the silence is so heavy, it can actually make your ears ring with a deafening pressure. Our main character is a man named Elias. Elias was a seasoned hunter, a man who grew up with a rifle in his hand and a deep, ingrained respect for the old rules of the North rules, like never leaving a fire unattended and never answering a voice in the woods that calls your name. He wasn't alone. He was with his longtime hunting partner, a boisterous, larger-than-life guy named Miller. They had shared dozens of camps together, survived bone-chilling blizzards, and tracked elk through terrain that would break a normal man's spirit. But in November of 2017, the Yukon decided to test them in a way that had nothing to do with the weather or the wolves. They had set up their base camp in a valley known by the locals as the Hollow, a place where the shadows always seemed a bit too dark even at noon, and the game tended to vanish without a trace. On the third day, Miller decided to head out alone to scout a ridge about 3 miles to the north. He promised to be back by sundown. But as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in a sickly, bruised purple, Miller hadn't returned. Elias sat by the wood stove in their small cabin, watching the clock. 6 p.m. passed. Then 8 p.m. The forest outside fell into what we call an oppressive silence. The kind of quiet that feels like the world has ended and you're the only one left to witness the aftermath. Suddenly, Elias heard a sound that broke the tension. It was the distinct crunch of snow, followed by a familiar, heavy footfall on the wooden stairs of the porch. The door creaked open, and Miller stepped in. He was covered in frost, his face red from the biting cold, and he looked absolutely exhausted. "Rough day, Elias," he said, tossing his gear into the corner with a dull thud. But something was off. Miller didn't head for the coffee pot like he always did. Instead, he sat in the corner shadow where the light of the kerosene lamp couldn't quite reach him. He sat with his back perfectly straight, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames of the stove, not blinking once. "Find anything out there?" Elias asked, his hand instinctively tightening around his tin mug. He noticed that Miller's breathing was silent, no huffing from the cold, no labored gasps from the long hike. "Found a spiral," Miller replied. His voice was identical to Miller's, but the pacing was fundamentally wrong. There was a microscopic, jarring delay between each word, as if he were learning how to construct sentences in real time by mimicking a recording. "A spiral of bones, Elias. Just like the ones we saw in Montana back in '94. Remember? The marrow was so sweet." Elias felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. His blood felt like slush in his veins. He and Miller had never hunted in Montana in 1994. They had met in 2002 Inches, a rainy shipyard in Seattle. They had never seen a spiral of bones together. "Right," Elias whispered, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Montana. I almost forgot. That was a hell of a trip." He watched Miller, or the thing that looked like Miller, carefully. The man's skin seemed to be vibrating, almost rippling, as if something underneath the surface was shifting and trying to adjust its fit. When Miller reached out to warm his hands by the fire, Elias noticed his fingers. They were too long, just by an inch or two, but enough to make them look like the legs of a giant spider. And then there was the smell. It wasn't the smell of sweat, wood smoke, and pine. It was a cloying metallic stench, the smell of wet copper and old stagnant earth that had never seen the sun. "You okay, Miller? You look different," Elias said. Testing the waters, his hand slowly moving toward the shotgun leaning against the wall. The thing in the chair turned its head. It didn't turn like a human. It was a sharp, mechanical snap. "I'm just hungry, Elias. The hunger. It's like a fire that won't go out. Don't you feel it too?" As it spoke, its jaw seemed to unhinge slightly further than a human jaw should go, and for a split second, Elias saw a second row of jagged, yellowed teeth behind the ones he recognized as Miller's. "I think I left the extra kerosene in the shed," Elias said, standing up slowly, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't look back. He walked out the door into the biting, sub-zero cold, and instead of going to the shed, he sprinted for the ATV. As he threw his leg over the seat and turned the key, the engine roared to life, echoing off the silent trees. He looked back at the cabin window one last time. Miller was standing there, his face pressed so hard against the glass that his skin was turning white, but his face was melting. The skin was sagging off the bone, the blue eyes were now nothing but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger, and a pair of dark, velvet-covered antlers were beginning to push through his forehead. The creature opened its mouth, and in Miller's boisterous, laughing voice, it screamed through the glass, "Where are you going, Elias? We haven't even finished the memories yet." "The marrow is almost ready." Elias pinned the throttle. He drove through the night, his vision blurring from the wind and the sheer, unadulterated terror. He felt like the trees were shifting their positions around him, trying to warp the trail to lead him back to the cabin. In his peripheral vision, he saw pale, spindly shapes jumping from branch to branch with a jerky, unnatural gait that no human could ever achieve. He didn't stop until he reached a highway outpost 50 miles away, stumbling into the fluorescent light of a gas station, sobbing and screaming for someone to call the police. The authorities went back to the cabin 2 days later. What they found defied explanation. The cabin was completely empty. Miller's gear, his rifle, even the food in the pantry had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no tracks in the snow leading away from the porch. But they did find one thing in the wood stove. It wasn't wood ash. It was a pile of Miller's teeth, all 32 of them, perfectly intact and arranged in a small, intricate spiral on the metal floor. There is a theory among the deep woods researchers on Reddit that the Wendigo, or a variation known as the Fleshgate, doesn't just kill its prey. It consumes the very essence of them, harvesting their memories to use as bait for the next person in the circle. It wears the life of the person it took like a mask until the mask rots away. But the real question The one that keeps Elias awake at night is this. Elias moved 3 states away, changed his phone number, and never told a soul where he went. But last night, at 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. He picked it up, and on the other end, he heard his own voice, not his old voice, but his current shaky voice saying, "Elias, you forgot your shotgun at the cabin. I'm standing right outside your front door to bring it back. What just happened?"